there are a couple of ways we could do this. By this, I mean the introduction. There are a few ways we could do the introduction. I could, and likely eventually will, have new intro music, but that's not a guarantee. I have been listening to some of your top-rated podcasts during my little hiatus, doing a little bit of field research, and a lot of them don't have introductions at all anymore because we collectively now have the attention span of a ferret on methamphetamine. People just eschew the introduction altogether. So sometimes now you get a cold open like this one. And most of my episodes used to be cold opens. I like that approach. A lot of people do that now because who has time for an introduction? Nobody's sitting through 20 seconds of nothing. We don't have the attention span anymore. So some people are not doing introductions at all. Others are just doing a really quick 3, 4, 5 note hook. And that's supposed to trigger your Pavlovian response that we're plugging into this world, into this podcast. Other people just use a sound effect and we're in. And I got to think about that. In the meantime, for the purposes of continuity, so this is not too disorienting for you, we'll open with this. Sound familiar? Feel familiar? Of course, there is one piece missing, and that is the John Huff Podcast bit. Because this is not the John Huff Podcast, okay? This is a John Huff Podcast. This is not the John Huff Podcast, and the fundamental purpose of this episode is to welcome you, one and all, to Semi-Eloquent with John Huff. This is news to some of you. It's not news to all of you. I actually began this process, this transition, and that is going to be a key word for this episode. I began the process of rebranding over a year ago. I did the initial mock-ups for new art over a year ago. The question at the time was, is this a new podcast or is this a rebrand of the old podcast? And I couldn't quite get my head around that. I never quite made that decision, but I went out and I had professional photos done and I began mocking up new artwork and beginning this process kind of surreptitiously on the sly. A couple people knew about it, my advisors. And then as I was moving this process along, all of a sudden my life fell apart. If you've been listening for any length of time, you'll know that just about exactly 1 year ago, initial discussions began between me and my former spouse or significant other about amicably ending our formal partnership. After what is now 28 years, we split up. And then any thoughts of rebranding, any thoughts of new initiative were instantly thrown out the window, okay? Because your humble host went very, very quickly into pure survival mode. Now, I made that look very elegant. I made that look very easy. But the truth is, I went into kind of a survival mode, from which I am only now, I think, beginning to emerge. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in this episode. But that put the kibosh on anything in terms of progressing or movement or anything like that. It was all we went inside, we went insular. We are now purely coping. We are not expanding in any way. We are coping. And I stopped making the podcast for a little while. Well, the initial kind of new reality hit, and I had to deal with that away from the pod. The reason I was thinking about rebranding in the first place is just that things have changed. I started this podcast in 2019. It was a different world. It was a different reality. And I chose badly my title. There were reasons for the title, but I chose badly my title. Now, your name as podcast title can work great, if you've got a name that anybody recognizes. Okay, the Jim Carrey podcast is going to do fine. The Taylor Swift podcast, why would you name it anything else? I should have named this show that. The John Huff podcast, limiting your market potential there, kids. Nobody knew who I was, and so choosing my name as the title is kind of setting you up for failure, but there was method to the madness at the time. Now, this is 2019. At the time, I had been 3-4 solid years into working as a hired gun drummer. And one of the things that happens when you work as a hired musician is that you become, in my case, kind of an interchangeable drummer unit. All right, the perk is you get booked on gigs and you get, if you're lucky enough, in my case I was, to tour, and you're not really responsible for anything and you get paid, and that's a sweet ride, man. It can be. The downside is you don't really own anything. All right, you don't own the music you're playing. You're not in the band. Your name's not on the poster. You live kind of anonymously, and you become, I found out the hard way, an interchangeable drummer unit. And I'm okay with that. I understand the lay of the land. I still operate that way, and that's fine. But at the time, it was difficult, okay, because I was beginning to understand the reality of this position. And bothered me a little bit. And I had been insecure about my playing. I had been insecure about my place in all of this. And I felt as though at the time I needed to establish and take some ownership of my own identity. The stuff I do, the stuff I play, who I am, as it were. I had been living kind of anonymously, with perks, but kind of anonymously. And it's like I wanted in some way to assert my identity. One of the reasons I started the podcast in the first place was to deal with, the tour come down, which I've talked about at length in the past, this period of depression that can follow being out on the road when you are living the dream, experiencing the highest highs, and then you come home to a total silence. In my case, without really a lot of work on the horizon, and then the finances, and then everything comes into your self-confidence. Coming off the road can be rough, especially if you don't have a lot of stuff lined up. But I was also dealing with this reality that the music I was playing was not mine. All right, I did not own these projects. I was not a contributor to much of the music, whereas I had been in band situations. I've written for bands. Different thing. As a hired player, you're just a hired player, man. And so there was no, for me, real, genuine creative output. And so the podcast was an antidote to depression, an antidote to idle hands. I needed something that was mine. And so calling it my name made a certain amount of sense, especially as I was beginning to try to grow into my own confidence as a player, my own confidence as a man. I struggled mightily in the early days of being a hired player with, am I good enough? And I was very self-conscious about that. And I realized that I had to overcome that self-consciousness, begin to own the things I do, own the way I play, own what I bring to the game, accept that what I bring to the game isn't what everybody wants, but it's what some people want. And I had to develop a bit of confidence in that. And part of that was owning who I am. And so when it came to naming the podcast, I didn't put a whole lot of thought into it. I just said, I'm calling it the John Huff Podcast. And when I launched my website, it was john-huff.com. It was, in fact, publicly owning my name. And there's a certain amount of psychology that goes with that. And then the initial artwork was this wonderful illustration that the great Danny Gauthier did of me. And I'm holding out a microphone as if for you to speak. And that was the initial impetus of the show. It was an interview-based show. And so that artwork became symbolic of the nature of the program. It's me giving the microphone to you, my welcome guest, to have your say. And that's the way it was for a while, but it began to change. And I developed this real affinity for doing solo episodes. And then I realized that the podcasts I listen to are solo podcasts. I did an interview show because interviews of they're what I've always done as a blogger, as a writer, as a freelancer. Interviews, and I think I do them well, but I began to realize that my heart is more in these solo episodes. I just prefer them as a listener, prefer them as a podcaster, and so the art became somewhat problematic because the show had begun to change. And then I redid the art a few years ago, switched to what you will recognize as the really cool, more modern, the blue one that my dear pal Jason Rank did. Great designer. And it's really cool and I like it a lot. But again, it was the same thing. It was created from the same photograph. In the photograph, I'm holding out drumsticks, but Denny replaced that with a microphone. Jay as well took that, put in the microphone. So it was ostensibly the same art, just a different kind of vibe to it. And then in the background, there was my drum set, cymbals. And it gave the impression, A, that I'm holding out the microphone to be spoken into, and B, that I'm talking about a lot of music. I got cymbals and stuff in the background. Again, didn't quite give the flavor of what the program was turning into. This has been a 6-year experiment. One of the reasons that I'm changing the name of it now is that it's beginning to find, I think, its foundation. The period of experimentation is ending. Up to a point. I think I have the idiom now. And so it makes a certain amount of sense. And so a year ago, I'm looking at all this like the show isn't really what it was. The name isn't all that effective. And I'm uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable with seeing my name on people's t-shirts. The ego in me that I wrestle so mightily with is like, that feels really awkward. Going around broadcasting my name to people now feels very awkward to me. And I understand the irony that the new art is like a full-on photograph of me, but I'm not putting that photograph on t-shirts, okay? The new art is, I just think, a step up into kind of more modern, pro-looking podcast art. I'm not trying to be generic. I just felt like this is where it wants to go. We're trying to level it up in every possible way. So I didn't like my name on it. The art didn't really reflect the show, and I'm very uncomfortable with it being my name. Ironically, after having gone through this whole process of owning my name. But things evolve, and that's the point. Things evolve, and that's the point. And then my life fell apart. Okay, life as I knew it collapsed. In the process of trying to rebrand this program, I had to shut it all down basically for a few months. And then when I brought the show back, I was still in coping mode, all right? I was still in survival mode. And I've spoken on recent episodes about this process that you go through. And I realized I actually, in my regular day job in the past week, encountered this kind of framework for change. This framework for change is 3 steps. It's the ending of something, it's a transition, and it's a new beginning. That is the 3-step process of change. A lot of people I've found get lost in the transition, right? Because the transition out of an old reality into a new reality is very vulnerable. It's uncertain, it is frightening, it is vulnerable. And the last thing that human beings want to be is uncertain, frightening, or vulnerable. And a lot of people get wrapped up in the transition phase of change without honoring, respecting, recognizing it. And I didn't really have a handle on this myself until my life fell apart. And I can now look back at the past year. It's been almost exactly, maybe it has been exactly 1 year since this process started. And I can see how different things are now than they were then, but I can also recognize the phases that a fella has to go through to reach what is turning into the new beginning. Give you an example. All this started last August, okay? And so in my shock, to go with that, I got a new regular full-time job, okay? I came out of the freelance world back into the regular world. Bit of a shock to the system, although I do very highly value getting paid consistently. There was a lot of change, and there was a lot of shame. There was a lot of self-consciousness. There was some mental health stuff. It's a very, very difficult thing to do to end a marriage. And we remain living together, which is also kind of a weird thing. It's an amicable separation, and thank the heavens for that. But in the early days, I spent hours walking my neighborhood. Just walking my neighborhood, just wandering around my neighborhood, trying to come to grips with what was happening, trying to imagine a future. And for the first probably 2, 3, maybe even 4 months, my imagination of the future was always built upon who would I be with and what sort of relationship would it be? And that is a natural thing to do. I mean, you've been with somebody for 28 years, 27 years at the time. You're very accustomed to being in a relationship. And the primary thing in your life, the primary thing that gets your attention, the primary thing that causes you emotion right now is the end of a relationship. And so you're thinking about relationships. You're used to being with someone, and now this has ended and it hurts. And so you're imagining how the next time around it will be different, because that's what you think life is. That is what life has been for my entire adult existence, being in a relationship with someone. And then seeing the ways in which that relationship maybe didn't work, or the things that I got wrong and the things that I would do better and how I wanted it to be in the future. But the assumption was the future involves somebody else, and maybe it does. But at the time, that was like a certainty. It's like you're looking around like, is it you? Is it you? Is it you? Is it you? Is it her? Is it that person? She smiled at me. And you're grasping as well for a kind of validation, right? You've lost the person. And so in your mind, you're like, please, somebody tell me I'm not repulsive to women of the opposite sex. All of this is part of the mental turmoil that accompanies the opening phase, man, the opening sequence of this process. At the time, I didn't recognize it as process. It's just what I was doing. I was reacting. I was very emotional at that time, not super rational, working more on sort of a gut reptilian level. But the thoughts of the future were all about who would I be with and what would that relationship be like. But then over time, I began to recognize a change happening. And especially when I went on my solo trip to Berlin, I began to recognize and imagine a different sort of future. And that future was not nearly as wrapped up in a relationship or who I would be with. I was coming out of the initial shock, the initial vulnerability, the initial need for validation, which required other people or another person, and beginning to grow into, wait a minute, maybe I'm okay on my own. Maybe there's something to solo life. Maybe there's something that I've overlooked here. And that trip to Berlin was a big part of it. Like being out in the world on my own and realizing there are certain things about that that are really good, actually, and really fun. And I have another solo trip planned, kids, for later this fall. Beginning to embrace that. And then since that moment, as I've returned to Berlin, and as I've gotten my feet more securely beneath me, moving out of the coping stage and into a kind of equilibrium, my thoughts of the future don't involve another person, right? That doesn't mean that I'm against it. It doesn't mean that I wouldn't date somebody. It doesn't mean that I'm not open to it, but I'm not taking that as an absolute. I'm not taking that as a certainty. I am moving through the phases. Back in the early stages of this, I needed the idea of somebody else. Okay, I needed the idea of another person to make me feel valuable, I suppose, to make me feel validated, to quote unquote complete my life, dare I say it. But that was what I needed at the time, right? That was the shape I was in at the time. It depended on another person. It was built around another person. But as you move through the phases, you begin to find this equilibrium. You evolve, you transition. You are in the transition phase. Sometimes you don't realize it. Now you come to here a year later, it's like I'm open to another person, but the future doesn't depend on another person. Solo life could actually be really terrific. And maybe this is just another phase on the way as well to whatever the new reality is. I don't know, but I recognize it as being healthier. I recognize it as being more stable, more solid, more in control, more hopeful, more exciting. And it's just an example of what a transition is. All right. You can go in one fell swoop from together to separated. Okay. But separated is not, it is a new reality, is not the new reality, is not the new beginning. The new beginning, I'm finding out, perhaps comes much later for some of us. And in the interim is this transition. And the transition can be bloody awful and scary. And so there were times when I was wandering my neighborhood, feeling hurt, feeling frightened about the future, feeling vulnerable, feeling as though I didn't have any value. And that sucks. And I would think to myself, this is life now? This is the new reality. This is the new beginning. This sucks. I don't like this. And a lot of people find themselves in that position, and then they make really, really bad decisions. They get into a relationship with a very bad person because they can't be alone, and they don't like this weird transition phase, and they think it's the new reality, so they better jump in with somebody else to save them. They get in with bad people, or they get into an unwanted pregnancy, or they get into some sort of really risque behavior. Sometimes that's just acting out. Sometimes that is a protest. Other times it's this transition scares me and I need to either be numbed or distracted or rescued from it. People make bad decisions, particularly in the immediate aftermath of a breakup. I was lucky. Okay, I was lucky. I'm not going to say that I was necessarily conscious. I did set out from the beginning to be above reproach. That is to not hurt anybody and not hurt myself and not do things that I would regret later. And I've been very lucky because I was not in a position to do any of those things. I'm not some kind of a saint over here. I just got a little bit lucky. I got a little bit lucky. I was not in the position to make really, really dumb decisions, and I didn't. And I'm grateful about that because a year later, I'm so much further down this road, and I can now understand and see the transition unfolding. And we're sneaking up now, I feel, on the new reality. It's not imminent, but it's coming, and I'm in a much more mentally stable position, emotionally stable position with which to greet the new reality. Okay, so don't get lost in the transition is my point, right? You lost your job. You lost your spouse, you lost your situation, and you are now in the transition. And you can make a lot of dumb ass decisions in this transition that will F up the new reality when it comes. Finding yourself perhaps in prison off a dumb decision will F up your future reality, which could be great. Right? You have to hold on to the faith that this transition is to something really good. But if you F it up by doing dumb stuff, getting into bad relationships, doing a lot of drugs and making stupid mistakes and blowing your money on stuff. If you do that, you are effing up your future reality. You are failing the transition. You are isolating yourself. You are hurting the people in your life who will not forget it. And in many cases, probably losing the people in your life. And yeah, you're vulnerable. And yeah, you're hurt. And yeah, you want to lash out. And and you need to keep your wits about you and not make dumb ass decisions that will wreck your life and wreck your relationships. A lot of people do that. I was lucky. I haven't yet done that. And I feel as though I'm in a stable enough position that I'm not going to do that. And it's also a really great time to move ahead with the rebrand. Okay, new reality, new life, new title for the podcast, new energy. Now, I've been building this as not a new podcast, just a renewed energy. And that's what Semi-Eloquent is, okay? The show is not going to change fundamentally, but the name is changing. The artwork is changing. I think it's leveling up in both cases. I want to do this. I want to grow this. I feel as though it's become a bit stagnant, and I'm hoping that these changes will help the show grow a little bit. But fundamentally, it's not going to change, okay? Once you get past the art and whatever perhaps new music I use, this will sound very familiar to those of you who have been listening low these many years. But the energy is coming back. All right. I've spent a lot of my energy in the past year just trying to keep it together. Just trying not to lose my friggin' marbles, man. But I feel as though I'm coming through the other side. And it feels right now to make this change and to put myself back into the show again. And I feel as though I have the energy and I want a fresh start. I want a fresh start that doesn't neglect all of the work that's gone before. And that's why a transition and not a new show. What is Semi-Eloquent? If you've been reading my program, my episode descriptions for the last 4 or 5 years, on this week's episode, your humble host waxes semi-eloquent about whatever it is. And I just like that as a hook. I think it works as a title. It's a little bit curious, it's intriguing, and it also speaks to a certain amount of self-consciousness. Semi-eloquent. We're not promising genuine eloquence. Semi-eloquent. It's me being just a little bit vulnerable for you. As I record what is ostensibly the first episode of Semi-Eloquent with John Huff, there's a heat wave, there is a power outage, and my laptop is getting ready to die. I wanted to keep this one short just to let you know we're back, let you know what's going on. Thank you for hanging with me through this transition. And just get the ball rolling again. I feel good. I feel good about it all. And I hope you feel good about it too. The reaction so far has been really, really positive from people, and I appreciate that very much. I am going to start talking about music again. Okay, I want to bring back, hey, check this out. Even as a farewell to each episode, I think the episodes will continue much like they've been, but I feel as though I have the energy and perhaps even the time to begin to dig a little bit deeper on some stuff. So maybe a bit more topical, maybe running a little bit deeper, maybe doing some history again. I really want the show to be edifying and valuable for you and for me. And I would like it to grow. And I feel as though now is the time just to take another full-on shot at it. So that's what we're doing. And with that in mind, I want to welcome you to Semi-Eloquent with John Huff. This week, I suppose, waxing semi-eloquent about transitions. And if you're trapped in one, respect it, recognize it, understand that you are going through a process of getting from the end of something to the beginning of something. All right. The transition is not the beginning. The transition is the step along the way. And what you need to do is make smart decisions, value your mental health, value your physical health, accept, have faith in the way things are, roll with it, and trust that life is going to deliver you on the other side to a new reality that is better. Your job is to not F it up by doing dumb stuff and hurting people and hurting yourself. If you can do that, you're going to get there, kids. And with respect to Semi-Eloquent, we're going to get there together. I want to thank you for listening. I don't know how I'm going to do these sign-offs. Should we do it the old way? Just for old time's sake? I don't know, man. This is a new show, so I'm just going to say goodbye. And if you miss, I'll check you later. Let me know. I'm not going to do the door closing. I'm not going to do an Easter egg at the end. You let me know if you missed those things, if you even knew they were there. For now, this is the bones of Semi-Eloquent. The production's going to get a little tighter going forward once I figure out what it is. Just wanted to give you that update. I thank you so much, and here we go. Sorry, couldn't resist.